Coming up next month, Elizabeth Reeves O'Connor will be talking about her use of GoReact to support student production of media, as well as a rapid workflow for captioning when she taught an intersession course. This is an interesting one. First, I'll introduce Liz Lawley. Elizabeth Lane Lawley has her master's in library science from the University of Michigan, so a nice connection to our new president, as well as her doctorate in information science from the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. Liz is a professor in the School of Interactive Games and Media and the director of the Lab for Social Computing. Her research is concerned with the interaction of games and tourism, as well as the social aspects of game design and play. Liz recently completed a semester as a U.S. Fulbright Scholar in Dubrovnik, Croatia. This particular talk is about what we call, in my department, non-supported tools, which is not to say they are forbidden, rather to say the expectation of support is not necessarily there. And this sometimes represents a tension for people who see us, promoting the monolithic learning management system. Somebody who saw the invitation for this event wrote to our director and said, I wonder if you're aware of the push in Academic Senate that all courses use my courses. So sometimes we get a little confused about the centrality of the LMS and the benefits of heterogeneous learning tools, treating the learning management system as sort of the hub or the connective tissue between those tools. In fact, EDUCAUSE supports this position. And just to read a quick quote from EDUCAUSE, the future role of the traditional LMS is an important consideration and worthy of careful discussion. In practical terms, the LMS will continue to be a hub for most institutional learning environments for the foreseeable future. While we espouse a component-based architecture, we don't prescribe which components. So kind of a nice callback to faculty autonomy and your ability to use your own best judgment. So in order to further fully inform you about tools available, I give you Liz Lawley with Fork Your Syllabus, Use Slacker.
So this is the title from the Digital Media and Learning Conference workshop that I gave last week. And in fact, the reason I'm doing this here is that Jeremiah saw the information about my workshop out in California and said, would you do that here too? And he actually suggested that I might want to do it before my one in California, thinking somehow that I might actually have it ready before the conference, which was a lovely thought. But I suggested it might be better for me to do it after I'd come back and give you the bugs worked out of it version. So I put this up earlier, but if you have a laptop with you, this URL will be useful to you, both while we're going through this, but also this is something that you can refer back to afterwards, because these materials really go through in a lot of detail all of the things I'm going to talk about, most of which I won't have nearly enough time to cover in the level of depth that I would like. I am more than happy to talk one-on-one with people after the workshop is over if you want to sit down and look at how to use any of these tools directly. But this is going to be sort of a quick overview. I did it in 90 minutes in California, and that wasn't enough time, and so I'm going to try to figure out how to do it even more abbreviated here. This is how I'm going to try to break it down. We have still got 3 minutes left for the introduction, but there's a whole lot of definitional stuff still to do. 15 minutes on how I am currently actually using GitHub in my classes right now, so that you can see how I've broken down the materials, the way that what kinds of materials I'm using GitHub for versus what I put in my courses, things like that. 15 minutes on how I'm using Slack in my classes, which I will tell you right now, I really resisted using any kind of chat-based thing, and I have totally changed my view on this over the past 10 months. And then if I have time, about 10 minutes each on how to create your own stuff, although that's the bigger topic and it really requires you to sort of sit down and play with things. So I'm only going to point you in the right direction. These slides, this is as much detail as there is on the slides. All of the actual content, and I'm going to come out of here for now, is in that site that I gave you, which is itself a GitHub repository. And it's a GitHub repository that's set up the way that I set up my course materials. Right? So this is not a repository of code. There's no downloadable source here. The only binary files you'll find in here are the images themselves that I'm using as illustrations. This is documentation. And I am using it. I started using it this past year. The reason I started using it is that I knew we needed to incorporate GitHub as a topic into our introductory web design class. Because increasingly web developers are working in environments where they have to share code in a collaborative environment, and Git is the tool of choice in many of the places they're going to go. So I wanted them to understand how, as web developers, not as coders, they would take advantage of this. And to do that, I mean, I had to learn it, something I had been avoiding doing for a very long time. I know how to use version control software. My experience with version control software goes way, way back to a very different kind of version control environment, very different from the distributed environment that Git and GitHub play. And one of the first things that I had to learn was what GitHub was, because people who aren't familiar with it tend to not understand the distinction between GitHub, which is a website on which you can host copies of files that are grouped together in a repository, and Git, which is the underlying software that you use on your computer. It runs on GitHub. It runs on various corporate servers. There are Git servers here on campus, lots of places that allow you to have sets of files that are connected to each other communicate. Now, how do you update files as you move through? How do you share the changes? How do you propose changes to something that you may not have final authority on? So typically, when you've got people collaboratively working on a document, you have one person who makes the final decision. Are we going to incorporate these changes? And you need a way for people to be able to suggest changes without them actually editing the document, right? Think about collaborative documents you've worked on and how, yes, you want everybody to be able to contribute, but you don't necessarily want all of those contributions to end up being part of the final version, right? So that's a lot of what Git is doing. And there are a lot of people who use Git without ever going to GitHub. But it's also possible to go the other way, which is to use GitHub without really understanding a whole lot about Git, to use GitHub as a site on which you publish materials. And so I'm going to talk more about what the advantages of doing that are. What I am going to suggest is that if you don't already have a GitHub account, go ahead and create one while I'm talking. Right? Go to github.com. They're free. It won't cost you anything to make one. They won't ask for any detailed, personally identifiable information. But it will allow you to do some of the things that I talk about as we go through, including making a copy of my materials and then editing those, which is one of the things GitHub lets you do. Yeah?
Quick contribution from the security side of things. You want to think about whether or not you want to have your name tied to your GitHub account. Mine is github.com/philstackpole, but other people choose not to have their own personally identifiable information tied to that.
Right.
So it'll be a longer-term discussion. Pick the name and then figure out.
And you can always create another one. Right. Yep. There's no rule that says you can't have more than one GitHub account. I have it under a username that I use on multiple systems, but it's pretty easy to see that it's my materials because most of my materials have my name on them. All right, the other thing I'm going to be talking about is Slack. And Slack is, at the most basic level, a group messaging tool. And it allows for group chat. It allows for individual private messages. It allows for you to be involved in a real-time conversation, but also to see messages asynchronously. It is, in fact, a lot more than that, which is why when you go to Slack's website and you click on the link that says, what is Slack? It never says, we're just a chat tool, right? It says, we are a work environment. They have all these ads. I see them on Facebook all the time these days, I think, because I did this workshop with stuff saying, Slack, it's where work gets done. Right? So Slack has really branded itself as the workplace chat and collaboration tool. And I have created, in fact, a Slack work group, and there's a link from there, for this workshop, which you are welcome to join. And I will stay in this. I usually say that once a workshop is over, I leave the workspace, and if you want to communicate with me, you need another form to do that. I'll probably stay in this one for a week or two before I drop out of it. The reason for dropping out is something I'll talk about when I get to using Slack and how I manage this as not being an overwhelming source of interruptions and noise in my workflow. Right, but you will, one of the things that I will talk about is, whoops, I really want this, how surprised I was at how it actually had the opposite effect in terms of making it easier for me to focus on the specific task of working with my students. Okay. So there's a bunch of links in here to help you with this. There's a guide to getting started in a Slack workspace. There's an important note here, and this is something I have to make sure I emphasize with my students. If you're already using Slack for a different group, this is not a centralized name and password server for all of Slack. Every Slack instance has its own set of user IDs and passwords. So, and often I have students who are using Slack as part of extracurricular group, as part of some other organization they're in, and they could certainly choose to use the same user ID and password, but they're not linked together. And so they have to create this as a separate system. And I'll talk more about that with the creating Slack.
Liz, what's the RIT-workshop.slack, because I can't quite see it.
So it should be linked from that first site, but the, whoops.
I have it. RIT Workshop-17.
So it's the same as what's up here, RIT, oh no, it isn't, it's RIT Workshop, isn't it? So, yeah. There is a link from that, but it's RIT Workshop -oct17.slack.com. So the issue that Jeremiah raised, that we got an email yesterday when the advertisement for this finally went out, saying, were you aware that we're being encouraged to use my courses for everything? And I'm going to talk in a minute when I talk about why I'm using GitHub as to what some of my problems with using my courses for everything is and why I really wanted to find another way to make my materials available. But I also am really sympathetic to the student's concern, which is you're asking me to go to 3 different places, right? And how am I supposed to know where I'm supposed to go? And it's not just that I'm asking them to go to 3 different places, it's that each of their professors has a different approach to where materials are going to be and how they're organized. And from the standpoint of a student who's taking 5 classes, I am not their only professor. I wanted to make this as easy as possible for them. And so what I did was I took advantage of the fact that my courses allows you to customize your navigation bar. And so what I did is I went in and I took out the link that says content, because the content management system in my courses, from my standpoint, is a train wreck. Right? It does not allow me to provide the kinds of materials that I want in a way that works well for me. And there are other issues as well. But what I did is I put 2 direct links from my courses. One is to the syllabus, which is on GitHub, and one is to the full list of topics for the class, broken down by week. And that's where I have all my readings. It's where I have all of my in-class exercises. It's where I have information about projects that are due. Anything that does not have personally identifiable information about my students goes on to GitHub. Nothing that does have information about them goes on there because that's public information. And not only is it not a nice thing for me to do, to put a bunch of stuff about my students out on the public internet, it's also illegal, which many of my colleagues I have discovered don't recognize, because as I was looking at some other class repositories out there, I kept finding class lists, and I kept sending little notes to people saying, this is technically a FERPA violation, you might want to take that down. The fact that somebody is in your class in a given semester is FERPA protected information. So nothing that's personally identifiable goes there. And then I also have a link up at the top to the Slack workspace. From the student standpoint, there are no more clicks involved in this than there would be in going to the content section in my courses or going to the discussion or chat functionality within my courses. They go to the class, they click on the link. So that really cuts down for them on the confusion and the where did you say the materials were and what's the URL for the Slack and things like that. Everything else I still keep in my courses. Grades stay in my courses. Drop boxes for submitted materials stay in my courses. Quizzes stay in my courses. Yeah.
Two questions I'm going to ask, and I'm going to leave at 3 o'clock, and please don't be offended.
Hey.
I get another appointment. One is, are you doing anything with Gitter, and are you going to touch on Gitter.im? And number 2 is, what about GitHub private repositories? What are the current implications for using a GitHub private repo? Because I know that students have GitHub education pack.
We do too now. They just opened that up for faculty, and I will talk about that at the end. So, and it's in the last piece, the creating content with GitHub. I talk about public and private repositories. I talk about the education discount, all of that. So.
We have a relationship with GitHub the way that we have a relationship with Gmail for students to keep Google from indexing content, so that GitHub has a requirement to keep.
No, and that's actually a separate piece. Than I'm not talking at all about student content on GitHub right now. That's a whole separate workshop I could do. This is just about faculty putting their materials out and making them publicly accessible. So that's how I do the integration, and that's how I am conceptually separating things out. The content that doesn't have identifiable information, the real-time communication, and everything else, which fits into those 3 buckets. And that has worked pretty well. Let me go. So GitHub. How am I using GitHub for my course materials? Okay. I'm using GitHub for my course materials very much like I am using GitHub for these workshop materials. Okay. I am taking content that includes links to external resources, documents that I have control over, things that I have created, and putting those all into the repository. And let me I'll pull one up in a minute to let you see, but let me first talk about why. And there are a bunch of reasons why I am doing this. Right? The first is I frequently get requests from people outside of RIT to know what I'm covering in my classes. Right? I am part of a community of people who teach in my field. People hear me talking about, well, I do this stuff in my Introduction to Web Design class. In fact, when I was building the materials for this class back in January, I was hanging out at the Google offices, and I had 3 people at Google say, I would really like to see what you do in your class. I can't give them that access. I can't let them see what I've got in my courses. There's no way for me to export my courses as a whole and let them see all of that content and how it's organized by week. And I don't want to maintain 2 separate sets of materials, and just to be able to share those with people outside. I hear from people who teach classes like this saying, I'd love to see what your assignments look like. I'd like to see how you break the topics up. I want an easy way to be able to share that information with people outside of RIT, and that's essentially impossible for me to do with my courses. I can't let them into a My Courses shell. Even if I could get permission to create a temporary account, we run into those FERPA issues again, because now they can see who are the people in my class, even though they don't have any legitimate reason to be directly involved. So that's the first thing. Okay? I hear from alumni who have taken my class in the past, and it turns out the stuff I teach changes. Right? It is not, Bill, you took my web design class 15 years ago, right? It was a little different back then, what we covered. Yeah. And so I am relearning stuff every year, updating, changing. I have past students, I will go onto Facebook and I will ask my students, what should I be including? But then once I've done it, they're like, I want to see, what did you choose? What resources did you include? They may have told me I need GitHub, but what are the GitHub resources that I'm giving to my students? What does the exercise look like? I want them to be able to have access to it too. And then internally, I have people within the department, right? People say, hey, I'm teaching that class next semester. Can I get your materials? I can give them my courses, course copy access, and they can do that. It's clunky, right? I still do that for them for things like Dropboxes and all of that, but I want them to be able to A, easily modify my materials, and B, share back with me some of the materials that they have then created. And this is, in fact, where GitHub allows something really special that you don't get in a read-only environment, which is that with GitHub, if somebody makes a copy of my materials, they can, and they make changes to those, they can submit those changes back, and I can incorporate them into my site. And it turns out I'm even, or not, right? But what's been really wonderful is a totally unexpected benefit that came up for this with me in teaching students who understand how to use GitHub. So I'm going to use an example of a class that's freshmen. They don't know how to use GitHub. They're not writing any code. This is just, you know, a distribution mechanism. But in my web design class, where the students have learned by week 3, hopefully, how to use GitHub, if they find an error in an in-class exercise, I say, send me a pull request. They modify it. They save it to their copy. They send a request to me. I click a button to merge it into my version, and now everybody has the changes. This does a bunch of really interesting things, right? First of all, it gives my students a sense of agency in the materials. It allows them to feel like they could change something. They could suggest a change to make it better, to fix a problem. Second thing is, I have many eyes all working on this stuff. And they used to send me emails, right? On the 3rd page of the week 4 Thursday exercise, you've got a typo in X, right? So then I've got to find the document. I've got to dig through until I find the exact thing and change it and save it and let people know. With this, they don't have to send me the email trying to describe where they found the problem. They just fix it, right? And send me that. And then besides that, I'm now modeling for them the behavior that they're going to need to have in professional environments and in working with open source software. So they're learning a process in the context of class without me ever actually teaching it and saying, you are going to need to know this. The doing it then becomes a model for them moving forward. But also my colleagues can do this. You know, colleagues here, colleagues elsewhere can take my stuff and then send a change back to me. And now, all of a sudden, instead of me gifting stuff, we're collaborating. They're working with me to try to make materials better, to let me know that they've found something useful that they could put back in. So that's all the reasons for doing it. Let me show you quickly what the freshman class repository looks like. So this is for my first, yeah.
Do you put a CC license in a repository?
Mm-hmm. I do. So I do put a Creative Commons license onto all of my materials. I do it both at the in the workshop stuff that we're looking at right now. I actually have it, I think I have it on the main page, and then there's also a license file in the repository. And in my class repositories, I try to remember to put a license file in there. It's not a super straightforward process in GitHub because they're so code focused that all of the license prompts that they give you are for code licenses, not for content licenses. But basically, I just cut and paste the Creative Commons license information into the license document and leave it at that. So that's, in fact, yeah, there's an example right there. So all I did was stick the code the Creative Commons gives you into the document and then save it in there. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Creative Commons, what that does is it gives, explicit permission for anybody who wants to use my materials to build on them. The 2 restrictions I put on it are 1, that they have to give me attribution, and 2, that they can't use it commercially. And in fact, I'm not super concerned about other faculty using my course materials commercially. I am really concerned about, say, Pearson using my materials commercially. And so that's the reason I put that restriction on there, because I don't want somebody to just grab my stuff and then sell it at an outrageous price to other people.
The other reason I ask is, you're talking about modeling practices.
Mm-hmm.
We have so many kids who are active in GitHub.
Yep.
I think that if they put something in GitHub, it's automatically open source or whatever, and they have to be told if you don't put a license in there.
And I do talk about that when I teach GitHub, but for this, the focus is not as much on my students as it is on my colleagues. So the default file in any GitHub repository is the README file. That .md extension stands for Markdown, which is a really simple language, much simpler than HTML, for saying, I want this to be a heading, I want this to be a link, and I'm going to show you how Markdown works, but it's much, much simpler to work with. You don't have to learn all of the details of HTML syntax to be able to do basic formatting. And I put all of my syllabus information in here. Contact information, links to the schedule, all of the stuff that would normally be in my syllabus is here, but with live links to the various pieces of content. One really nice thing about GitHub is that it keeps a full change history of every single file. So if I make a change to something, they can see that I've made a change to it. And in fact, I'll show you that I actually push that information into a channel in the class Slack so that they can see every time I've made changes to files in the repository. But this also addresses the issue of, if I make a change to an assignment, we don't have to have an argument about, well, that wasn't in the version at the beginning of the semester, because it's really clear if it changed, when it changed, and exactly what was changed each time that happens. So all of that is maintained in the repository. And then all of this is just the standard, syllabus-like stuff that I can copy a lot from place to place. I'll show you, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'll show you briefly, and I'll come back to this later if we have time, what the Markdown file looks like. That's the source code for this, and it's still completely human readable. Right? There's not a lot of complex syntax in here. A pound sign says make this a top level heading. 2 pound signs makes it a second level heading, etc. A dash in front of a series of items turns it into a bulleted list. If I indent it, then it's a next level bulleted list. And there's a fairly simple syntax for building in links to both internal documents on GitHub and external links. That's pretty much all I use. There's a lot of other stuff you can do with Markdown. There's a really nice guide on the GitHub site called Mastering Markdown. Markdown is used in a lot of contexts other than GitHub. GitHub has a specific type of Markdown that they use called GitHub Flavored Markdown, sometimes abbreviated as GFM. And so there are certain things that you can do in the Markdown specification that GitHub doesn't support. And certain things that GitHub does that are specific to GitHub. So I have provided a link in the materials to that GitHub flavored Markdown when we start talking about creating materials. So that's what happens in terms of what I provide. As far as my students are concerned, the fact in this class in particular, the fact this is on GitHub is irrelevant. It's a web page, and there's a link to it from my courses. And when they go to it, they see the content. For me to maintain it, it's a lot easier because I don't need any particular software. Any text editor will work. Or I can log in really quickly directly on the website and edit it if there's something that needs to be changed or added in a hurry. So it turns out, though, if this is just a website, why use GitHub and not just set up a website? Because I teach a web design class, right? I know how to set up a website. There's no reason not to just create an external website. And in fact, years ago, I did this blog post, like a lot of years ago. This made me feel so old when I dug this up. It was 2004. That was a long time ago. When I first started blogging, I actually figured out how to mod the really popular blogging software at the time, which was called MovableType, so that it could be used as courseware. And I published all these instructions about how to modify the software. And MovableType used something called trackbacks to let you know when somebody else blogged about your blog post. And there was a lot of interest, it turned out, in modifying MovableType back in 2004 for use in classes. And it's kind of fun to go through that now because a lot of those people at the time, 14 years ago, we were all assistant professors who were right at the edge of using new technologies. And now most of these people are full professors running major digital humanities initiatives and stuff. So it really does, it was a nice trip down memory lane to look through that. So I'm doing something comparable here, and I certainly could have modified WordPress to do this. Many people have, or set up my own web page, but then I lose all of that collaborative functionality. Right? If somebody uses my ideas for how to modify a blog template, there's no connection back and forth between their version of what I did and mine, with the exception of in that particular case where people pointed to the blog post. But I don't know who actually used it. I don't know who actually set it up. There's no connection, there's no link back. But in GitHub, if you make a copy of somebody's repository, it maintains a pointer back saying, here's where it came from. Okay? So not only can I see who made copies of my stuff, okay? Anybody who goes to their stuff can follow that link back to see what the originating source of information was. And having that built in, and the stuff I talked about in terms of the ability to edit your own copy and then send the changes back, brought that up a notch for me from just maintaining a website of materials. And that was my big push in terms of why I thought this would be more effective for that purpose. All right, Slack. So I did not use Slack for a really long time, despite the fact that I am what you might consider an aggressively early adopter of technology. And I run the lab for social computing, right? So Slack is smack dab in the middle of the stuff that I do. And I said I wanted nothing to do with it because the last thing I needed in my life was more interruptions, more notifications, more stuff grabbing my attention. And I was also concerned about it for my students for the same reason, right? There's too much stuff, there's too many notifications. I didn't want to do this. I resisted any attempt to do it in any work-related situation. And I changed my mind because my email has now become completely impossible to manage. And what I was finding was increasingly when students sent me email messages, I didn't see them. Okay? They got lost in the pile of other stuff that came in at the same time. And even if I went to my email with the specific intention of I am going to address my students' questions, there'll be a whole string of departmental politics and pressing grant deadlines and all of these other things that suddenly pull my attention away from what I needed to do. They're not interruptions, but they made it almost impossible for me to use email as a way to really focus on my students. Setting up filtering was not a sufficient solution to this because I'm still in the email program. Little notifications are coming up with you just got another message from this very, very problematic thread of messages, right? And now I'm over there looking at things that are going to stress me out and not thinking about my students. You guys don't know anything about what I'm talking about, right? So that was one of the things that had an impact on me. But in addition, it's back to this idea that I want to model in my classes the things that my students are likely to see in the workplace. And they are going to see Slack in the workplace. Almost all of them will, because it's so widely used right now in professional settings. And I want them to know how to use them properly. Like I do a whole lecture in the freshman intro class about appropriate uses of social technologies, right? How not to be an idiot online and ruin your job prospects. But this provides sort of an ongoing example and teaching environment where they learn how to use the tools effectively. We all know that they don't check their email nearly as often as we wish that they did, especially if we have something that we think is really important for them to read. Time-sensitive stuff, they will look at their email eventually, but time-sensitive stuff is not going to get to them, right? If you need them to see this because you're canceling class in an hour, email is not the way to let them know this because they're not going to see it until 4 hours later if you're lucky. Right? So I wanted a better way to be able to push important information to them if it was really, truly time sensitive. I wanted them to be able to use it for group communication. One of the things I found when I set up groups for projects is that they all pick their own tool. Sometimes there are issues where the whole group, except for one person, wants to use Facebook Messenger, and that person isn't on Facebook, and they resent being asked to join Facebook, and then I've got to moderate, or they leave that person out entirely because the rest of them want to use this particular thing. At the end of a semester, I always have students who rate somebody in the group low because they didn't participate, which often means they said things I didn't like, not that they didn't participate, or that the person tried to participate and their ideas were pushed aside. I want to be able to see that stuff. Right? But they're not going to let me into their Facebook Messenger groups. They're not going to include me in their group chat stuff. So instead, what I do is I create private groups in Slack, and I make myself a member of those groups. I don't hang out in there and make a lot of comments, but they can invoke me anytime they want, and I will come address it. And at the end of the semester, or during the semester, if it seems like things aren't going so well, I can take a quick peek and say, what's actually happening here? Did people participate in a meaningful way? My courses has some chat functionality built in, but it's awful from a user interface standpoint. They're not going to stay logged into my courses all the time to be able to have those collaborative conversations. Okay? It makes it easy for me to put external people into the chat. So in the spring, I was doing a class where we were working with Genesee Country Village and Museum. And I wanted the people associated with GCVM to be able to interact directly with my students and for them to be able to ask questions. So I can just put them into a Slack group so that I can have, if I have a guest speaker, I can put them in. All of that makes it much easier for me to add and integrate other people. And then one of the things that Slack really sells itself on is this idea of integrating other services. Right? So that if you have things in Google Docs, which my students do because they use that for peer review of each other's papers, if you have stuff in Trello, which is the project management system I encourage my game design students to use for project management, all of that can be integrated into Slack. So an example of that, let's RIT Workshop, there we go. I can't put you into my student Slacks, which is why I create one for the workshop, because again, personally identifiable information. But what you can see in here is that there is in fact a GitHub channel. Okay? And every time I have made a change, I was kind of busy this morning making changes, every single change with its commit description gets posted by GitHub into this channel automatically. I don't have to do anything. That just shows up in here. For work groups working on a shared code base, that's a really nice piece of functionality, and you can customize which pieces of information get shared, which repository is being monitored. So that integration is less useful for course materials, very useful for them to understand how it works. But having things like Trello and Google Docs integrated, Dropbox, other kinds of file sharing, means that they can use Slack as an easy way to centralize information coming from a variety of sources. So that's a useful thing for them. But the real issue is that it's not just me, it's also them that need to reduce the number of things they're looking at and stuff they're getting pulled at. What I have found for me is that using Slack has allowed me to have a firewalled space in which I can interact with my students. I have the Slack client on my phone. It's on the front screen of my phone. It doesn't have pop-up notifications, but I can see the little red number that shows up if people are sending me messages or if there are posts in the help channel. And I can check it a couple of times a day, and if it's something I can answer quickly, I just do it on my phone, and then I'm done. And if it's not, I star that message. At the end of the day, when I have time, I go through and I respond in more detail. And when I go in to look at those starred messages, I am not immediately pulled in to the 57 other projects that have overdue deadlines and crabby people associated with them. When I am in Slack, I'm dealing with my students. I am only logged in during the semester to my current class Slacks. I don't use it for anything else. It's why I leave the workshop Slack after the workshop is over, because much as I want to be helpful to my colleagues, you don't get priority access to me the way my current students do. And for me, that was the single most valuable thing that I have gotten so far out of Slack, is this ability to say, this is where I get questions from students, where I know what's going on. But it was a little bit of a harder sell in the spring to get students to install the mobile client rather than logging in to the website when they remembered to do it, to use it for anything that I hadn't actually required it for. So I spent a lot of time over the summer thinking about how can I do a better job of not requiring them to use it, but making them want to use it. Now, what kind of intrinsic motivation can I generate that will pull them in and make this, to them, a valuable tool? And the first thing I do is I make it really clear to them that I am not going to spam them with this. When you join Slack, you're immediately put into what they call the general channel, which you can rename. I renamed it to announcements. In the announcements channel, I limited it so that only my TAs and I are able to post to the channel. So there aren't any, reply all issues. There's not any stuff being posted by students who are confused. It's only the stuff that we consider to be time sensitive enough that it's worth interrupting them. Okay? And we're really careful about that. So since I can't show you the actual Slacks, what I did is I went in and I anonymized stuff in my existing Slack. And this is from this fall. I come up East River Road from West Henrietta to come to school, and my class is at 8 a.m., which is not a time I'm usually on East River Road. And I had no idea that there's ever traffic on East River Road. So the first couple of weeks of the semester, I kept being in this panic moment where I'd be in stop and go traffic on East River Road. I was like, what is this? Thinking I am not gonna make it to class on time. My TA can't unlock the classroom. But by sending this, I know my TA has notifications turned on her phone for Slack. She was able to, as soon as she saw this, tell the students outside the door, it's okay, she's on her way, she's just going to be 5 minutes late. Right? That actually resulted in a lot more students turning on notifications on Slack, because they were like, oh, that was really useful that you knew that. Right? I sent out a thing with a few hours to go before papers were due to say, there are a bunch of people who don't have their papers in yet. If that's you, you should do something about that. And as a result, I only had 2 people not get their papers turned in on time, which may be a record for me in a freshman class. So having this be limited to stuff that's high value for them, and that they would want to be interrupted about, like I'm giving you an extension on this assignment, or I'm canceling class because I'm sick, that made it really attractive to be told about stuff. I do an introductory exercise at the beginning of the semester where I require them to log into the class Slack and post something to the introductions channel. Okay? In my web design class, I actually use that for them to give me their GitHub usernames. And because I'm going to need those in the second week when I set stuff up about private material that I have on GitHub for them to access. I have to add them to a team. Their username on GitHub could be anything. They don't necessarily have it tied to their real world identity or their RIT ID. So this immediately gives me a link between their name and their GitHub user ID that I can use. So this doesn't to them feel like as much of a waste of time. Instead of having me email that, which then I have to pull all of those emails out and collect them and send them to my TA, who's actually going to be the one who puts the team together, all of this stuff is in one place. And it's easy to see if somebody has or hasn't participated in that channel. But by doing that, I get them familiar with the environment, and I also walk through in class how to, A, install one of the Slack clients on your mobile device, because I say this is going to make it more useful to you, because you'll actually know if something important happened, and then how to customize notifications. And this is really critical. How to set up a do not disturb period where you will not get any interruptions at all. How to say these are the only channels that I want notifications from. I tell them, if all you do is have yourself be notified by the announcements channel and private messages, you're going to get lots of value out of this, and it's not going to be a time sink. And in fact, all I have it set up to do on my phone is the announcements channel, the help channel, and private messages. I have everything else muted. Nothing else comes up. If it's a private message or help, it means that they need my attention. If it's announcements, it means it's one of my TAs, and I want to know what they're telling the class. And so that's why I have those particular things turned on. The other thing I did is I wanted them to see Slack as an informal, comfortable place to be able to ask me questions without the sense of formality that email often has for them. So, there's all this stuff about, young people don't use email. Well, that's actually not true. Young people do use email. But they use email the way most of us use postal mail, right? It's for official documents. It's for official communication. It's, it will be saved and stored, and it'll be part of your permanent record, right? It has weight to it. Those of us who didn't grow up with email still have a sense, an inaccurate sense, of email being ephemeral, right? It's not as solid as a piece of paper. It is, in fact, but it doesn't feel that way to us. We're perfectly happy to do quick messages back and forth. Most of our students use chats for this, right? They use text messaging, they use WhatsApp, they use, GroupMe, they use whatever their particular group of friends uses as their shared chat application for that kind of, less formal, less weighty stuff. I wanted them to start communicating with me that way. I wanted them to feel comfortable asking questions, particularly for freshmen who are afraid to come to my office, who, I'm an authority figure, I am scary, I may be small, but I have presence, and I know that. And so as a result, that can be really intimidating for a new student. I wanted them to have a way to approach me that didn't feel scary. So what I tried, and it worked really well, over the summer my older son, who's a doctoral student at U of R, had set up a Facebook Messenger group called Toon World. And he and all of his friends just shared songs that they really liked. And he invited me to join, which was awesome, because it turns out he has a really good taste in music. And instead of me saying to him, what should I listen to, I could just pull stuff out of this channel. And I thought, what if I did that in class? Because when they're working on in-class exercises, I usually play music. I play music because they're much more likely to talk to each other and to me if there's music. If the room is silent, nobody wants to talk. And if they ask a question, everybody can hear them ask the question. And that's scary and embarrassing. If there's music, the whole tone of the room changes. I tell them, bring your headphones, listen to your own music if you hate mine. And I thought, well, what if I did something like Toon World? And I said, tell me what you would like to have on the class playlist. Right? Now, all of a sudden, this is fun. My professor is asking for music and is willing to play it. I had one kid come up to me and say, my father would never play music like that. And I was like, I am not your father, it turns out. Luke, yes. And so they share songs. It's a way for them to participate as a group. They're not emailing it to me. They're sharing it in a channel that everybody can see. They're sharing something about themselves. I get lots of great music suggestions. I get some that are not so good. I do curate them before they go onto the class playlist. I've told them I don't want screamy, angry music, which turns out doesn't have a specific genre associated with it. I asked my partner who likes that kind of stuff, and he was like, well, it could be this type or that type, and I was like, you're really not helping. I'm just going to tell them screamy, angry music and play them a couple of 5-second clips to illustrate, and they've been pretty good on that front. But this got them thinking about Slack as being a place that was kind of fun, that was kind of relaxed, where they could share stuff and it didn't have to be like a big deal. The interesting thing is, when I did this, immediately one of the students in the class, because freshmen, created a dank memes channel, which provided an excellent teaching moment. Where I could say to them, you are absolutely welcome to create channels. And I love that you did this, right? Create channels, talk to each other, make them on topics. Be aware, however, that I can see all of those public channels and that you might not want to put something into that public channel that I would find deeply problematic, because at the end of the day, I am still giving you the grade for the class, right? And you need to think about, and this just goes to the stuff that I already talked to them about, which is how do you present yourself in different contexts? Things that are totally okay if it's a group with just your friends, maybe not so okay in the classroom. And let's think about what works and what doesn't work. I didn't say you can't do it. I just said be careful. Think about your choices.
Please don't make me call campus safe.
Yeah, yeah, we're not going to have time to actually do the whole creating stuff, although you have access to the step-by-step on what to do. But I do want to finish with some of the Slack stuff. I have a couple of Slack-only opportunities in the class. So you don't have to use Slack. Once you've done that initial introductory exercise and posted whatever I asked for, you could never log into Slack again and still get an A in the class. But there are a couple of things that I do where I am sort of going out of my way to help them, where I say, if you want this, you have to log into Slack and ask for it. So for example, doing a revised and resubmitted project, which is extra grading for me. I don't have to do it. I say, I will only do it if you send me a Slack message asking me to do it. In part because I want them to open up that communication with me at that point. Because if they need to revise and resubmit, it's because they didn't do a good job and maybe they need a little bit of feedback from me. So now we have the start of a conversation where we might not have had that otherwise. I have integrated, as I said, the GitHub stuff, and I integrate Google Docs and I integrate Trello so that they can see that this is a place where they can aggregate other information that they need. I have made an absolute commitment to quick responses. I check Slack every day. I don't check it every 10 minutes. You know, I don't even check it every hour. But I check it at least twice a day to see if there's a quick thing I can respond to. And at the end of the day, I deal with anything that's a longer response that's necessary. That has worked out pretty well. It does not feel burdensome. I do not get so much stuff coming in. I have 90 students this semester. I'm using Slack in all 3 classes. And it has not been overwhelming. Right? But it has been a lot more of the kind of quick question, I'm having trouble with this, that didn't used to get asked because the burden of figuring out when my office hours were, getting to the right place at the right time, coming into my office to ask this tiny little question that they don't necessarily want to use email for because email, again, feels like a big deal too. This has worked really well for quick questions. Yeah. I still use email. It's not like email went away. If a student, if I'm dealing with, grade issues, early alert issues, academic honesty issues where I need a paper trail and I need it to have that sense of formality, still goes out by email. Right? I don't do that on Slack. Slack is for the lightweight stuff. Slack is for the, we don't need a permanent record of this. Right? This is just you asking me a question. So that's the basics of how I'm using Slack. And overall, I have been delighted with it. I don't really have enough time to go through much of this, but let me just tell you what's in these documents so that if you want to go through this at more leisure. This is about how to create content on GitHub. I address 2 different things. One is 2 different ways of creating content. Forking a repository is making a copy of that repository in your own GitHub account with a link going back to that. So this morning I actually forked this repository into my personal account, and in the top corner there, it doesn't just say, okay, now my personal user ID has that repository. It has a little line underneath it that says forked from, and then where the original source of that was. Okay? Similarly, if I go up to, let me bring up, no, not that one. So here's my introduction to web design class. up here, where there's this little thing that says fork, and then there's a number next to it. The 11 is the number of people who have made copies of this repository for their own use. And if I look at this part, I can see a list of who those people are. 2 of those people are my colleagues at RIT who are teaching another section of this class and wanted to use my stuff as a starting point for their version. The rest of them are my current students who have forked the repository so that they can make changes when they find mistakes and send those to me. It also shows a little diagram that shows when other people have created stuff. Each of those colored lines is different people's versions, and then how they all come back in as I accept the changes that they've made and put them into the repository. So let's so if when I fork a repository, or if you fork a repository, those are then your files. And I walk you through in this page how to fork the workshop materials into your own GitHub account, and then how to actually go in and edit those files. So there's a whole section here on the process of editing and a link to that. Did it open it in another tab? There it is. That guide to Markdown that GitHub publishes that lets you see examples of how do you do a list, how do you add an image, how do you do headings. It lets you put in code blocks, which for me is really helpful because it will also do syntax highlighting of those code blocks so they can see CSS or HTML properly formatted and highlighted within the code examples. So that's what's in here, is this process of how you would go through and modify that. The other thing is, what you might have noticed is, I really want it more like this, that this material is not in my personal account, but in an organization account, or not an organization account, in a GitHub organization. One of GitHub's biggest flaws is that you can't organize your content very well. If you have 13 repositories in GitHub, you have a list of 13 repositories, you can't even customize the order in which they're displayed. And that means that as I proliferate repositories on a semester by semester basis, it gets harder and harder for people to be able to find the materials that they're looking for. When I talked to GitHub about this, they said, oh, you should just create an organization for your classes. I was like, but my classes are different every semester. You want me to create a new organization for every semester? And they were like, absolutely. I said, okay then. So I have a different organization for each semester, and within that organization, so this semester I have an organization called Lawley Fall 2017. That's where my class repositories go. For these things I'm doing for workshops, I created one called Liz Lawley's Workshops. There's no cost to create an organization, and up until about a week ago, the only way a faculty member could have free repositories, free private repositories. This is the difference between a paid and a not paid repository. A not paid repository, a free repository, is public. You do not have an option to make it private. If you want it private, you have to pay. This is how GitHub makes their money. There are a lot of things I don't want private, including things that my students are actively involved in editing, because again, personally identifiable information. Students have always had an option to apply for an education pack that gives them unlimited free private repositories. Up until sometime in the past 10 days, it changed as I was doing my screenshots. It used to be faculty could only get free repositories for an organization. So you had to create an organization for your classes and then apply for that organization to have free repositories. That was the other reason all my stuff was in organizations. Sometime in the past 10 days that changed, and they started letting teachers apply for the education pack as well, which means you can have unlimited free private repositories in your own account. And there's a link in here to find the education pack and sign up for the discount. Basically, if you sign up with your RIT address, you should get approved within the hour because they're looking at email domain to ensure that you're really associated with the university. And then the only other thing is, this last page, which is basically about setting up your own class workspace. And instead of replicating material that's already out there and better documented than anything I could put together, I gave you primarily a link here to the Getting Started for Workspace Creators Guide that walks you through the whole process of creating one, of configuring it, of changing permissions. I added a few pieces of information up here, mostly about the free versus paid issue with Slack. Slack's paid version has a couple of really nice advantages to it. One is it keeps all the messages and they're all searchable. Okay? If you don't do that, once you hit 10,000 messages, and that's everything, every single private message back and forth, every file uploaded, everything, then they disappear. They don't really disappear. They're in the database, but they scroll out of sight from a search and display standpoint unless you upgrade to a paid version. Problem is their pricing model is completely unworkable for educators because it's a per user, per year charge, even with their educational discount. Their educational discount is an 85% discount, which is great, and it means you're paying $12 per user per year per workspace. Okay? That's not feasible. If I'm teaching 90 students this semester, okay, that's a lot of money at $12 per student, and it doesn't, if they take another class from me in the spring, that's a totally different workspace and thus a different charge. And so this is not feasible. So I use the free version, and it does mostly what I need. It's another reason, though, to use it only for that kind of ephemeral communication, because you aren't going to be able to go back and see every message that they posted, you know, every bit of participation. This hasn't been a huge drawback. The other thing you lose is the ability to use your organization's single sign-on. Hey, that would be the thing that I would really love to have, is to let them log in with their RIT user ID and password instead of having to create a new, but that's a fairly small inconvenience for being able to use this free of charge in every class that I've got. So this walks you through how to do all of that and then reminds you to go back and look at the using Slack page so that you can see what I did to try to configure it in a way that worked well for my students. And I am sorry I went 5 minutes over, but I managed to get to something on all 5 of the pages, so yay me. And thanks for coming on short notice. So,
Liz shared a couple of really useful resources and URLs that I'll be happy to email to all of you shortly after we break.
and all of it is linked from that one main URL at the beginning. So.